Welcome, everyone, to the Religion Unplugged podcast, your regular plug-in for all of your religion news and culture. I am Joseph Holmes, semi-regular host of the Religion Unplugged podcast and regular host of The Overthinkers, which you can check out at theoverthinkersjournal.com. My guest today, I'm very excited, is the author of The Toxic War On Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles The Sexes, as well as Love Thy Body, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth and Total Truth. She is professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. She has been quoted in the New Yorker and Newsweek, highlighted as one of the 5 top women apologists by Christianity Today, and hailed in the Economist as America's pre-eminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. She is the noble, the nifty, the notorious Professor Nancy Pearcey. Professor, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I was telling you beforehand, I was very excited to read your book and to talk to you. I was hearing about your book from other people and followed you on social media and saw all the, arguments you're having back and forth with people and people reading your book and kind of talking about what's in the book. And I was like, well, okay, this is, she's making a lot of people on both sides of the political, religious, and philosophical aisle very mad, and that's usually a good sign that it's going to be interesting to read. So, how has that? I guess first off, what have you been thinking about the response to your book? How has that struck you?
Well, the response started before it was even published. It has proven to be the most controversial book I've ever written. And that did surprise me because my earlier book, Love Thy Body, covered issues like abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, which is really exploding now. So I was surprised that masculinity was actually more controversial. Yeah. When I was in the writing process, I taught several classes on the manuscript. I did a lot of reading groups on the manuscript. I like to get a lot of feedback, rub off the rough edges. And when they would tell their family and friends about the book, invariably the first question was, whose side is she on? With that tone, whose side is she on? By the way, the second question was always, and why is a woman writing a book on masculinity anyway? And so that basically men tended to assume, since I was a female writer, I must be a male-bashing feminist. More progressive people assumed I was some sort of angry, defensive, reactionary culture warrior. And so I have to tell you, I rewrote chapter 1 multiple times to kind of get over that initial hostility. Because when people got into it, as you probably noticed, it's a very fact-based, data-based book. And when people got into the actual facts, they said, oh, yeah, this is interesting. I didn't know this. But I had to get readers over that initial hump. And then you've seen some of the response after it came out. It was the day after it was published that a Twitter storm erupted.
Yes.
And Christian egalitarians jumped on it and said, to be honest, most of them hadn't read it yet. Okay, so again, they were reacting to what they'd heard. And many of them, here's the actual language. You're giving ammunition, their word, ammunition to complementarians, which is dangerous and harmful and bad, which was odd because I don't even engage the complementarian egalitarian debate. And I even explain why I don't, which we could go into if you want. But that lasted about 3 weeks on my Twitter feed.
Yes, I was watching some of that. It was, it
was kind of fun. I mean, until finally the magazine Mere Orthodoxy wrote an article on it defending me.
Yeah.
And after that, the main person leading the attack, I mean, she's a public figure. I don't know if you want to name her or not, but anyway, she apologized.
Okay. Well, that's great. Yeah.
It is.
That's good.
And then the conservatives took over and they began to object to it as well. So you're right. It has won enemies on both sides. Which is usually a sign that at the very least you're saying something interesting, Yeah, I think so.
Which is what I like. Again, the fact you're getting attacked from both sides doesn't mean you're right, but it does mean that you're thinking through the problem and not immediately falling into tribalism. And that's always a better place to be. So I want to dive into that. So yes, the book we're talking about is, the Toxic War On Masculinity book, which has just come out. If you didn't, gather that from our conversation so far, and it's diving right in, of course, to like one of the biggest conversations we're having right now, which is about toxic masculinity, which is, based on the fact that, people are observing that, the reality is that within society, men are more likely to commit the majority of murders, the mass shootings, the rape and sexual assault and marital abuse and the like. And so this idea of toxic masculinity, that the reasons are either, men are innately worse than women, or that the way society socializes men and men socialize each other is worse than the way society socializes women. Of course, this has been in, been prominent in the religious sphere, particularly the evangelical sphere, with, scandals like Ravi Zacharias and books that have come out, like Jesus and John Wayne, which, is talking about how the evangelical church is at the forefront of the problem. So you were already a celebrated author by this point, at least celebrated in certain circles, like the circles that I run in, Love Thy Body, is touted and recommended a lot. What about this conversation, made you say that you wanted to write a book on it? You thought that this would be a topic that you would have a particular voice to enter the conversation in. And for readers who haven't, read your book or heard about your book, what would you say is sort of like the main thesis of the book that you came away with, of something to say about it?
Yeah, I would say that the final trigger in writing the book, clearly my attention was drawn to the fact that it's become extremely acceptable to express hostility against men. The Washington Post had an article titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" Really? Respected mainstream publication. Huffington Post editor tweeted, #kill all men. You can buy T-shirts that say, "So many men, so little ammunition." and books that they come out with titles that say just bluntly, "I hate men," or "No good men," or "Are men necessary?" And there have even been males coming out as well. A fairly well-known male author wrote a book in which he said, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. And then this one, you might have seen this because it was more recent. The director.
I remember all of these things that you're talking about.
Okay. Wow, you've just stayed on top of them. Well, here's the one. This is the only one not in the book because it was more recent. But the director of the movie Avatar.
Oh yeah, James Cameron. Yep. Yeah.
Testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system.
Yep.
So clearly, this is what first caught my attention because I thought we need to get to the bottom of this. There's a study that found that about 46% of American men, so almost half of American men, agree with the statement, these days, society seems to punish men just for acting like men.
Yep.
So whether you agree or not, that's a lot of people who are starting to think men are getting a bad deal. And so this was the first reason I decided to take the subject, because I thought, I write books on apologetics. So I write books on how do we analyze, how do we critique the secular world? And so I kind of wanted to see, why is it that the secular world gets masculinity so wrong? That was my first goal. And so I spent a lot of time, as you note in the book, sort of historically going through how the script of masculinity got secularized through several stages, how we got to Andrew Tate, the masculinity stereotype of fast cars, fast money, fast women. I kind of wanted to show where that came from. So that was the first reason. But there was a second reason, and it actually was the final decision-making factor, and that was when I started reading sociological studies on Christian men. And, obviously in the secular narrative is that Christian men are exhibit A of toxic masculinity, right? That they are any sort of male headship in the home turns men into overbearing, tyrannical, coercive patriarchs.
Yeah.
And so let me give you just one quote on that. So it was easy to find them on with a quick Google search.
Yes, it is.
So I'll give you just one. This was the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which came after the Me Too movement. And she said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today.
Yeah.
So the thing is that social scientists were reading these accusations, psychologists, sociologists, and saying, where's your evidence? You're making these charges, but where's your data? And so they went out and did the studies. And so in my book, I quote roughly a dozen different studies. And what they found was the exact opposite of the media narrative. They found that, in fact, evangelical men test out at the top of the heap. They test out as the most loving husbands and fathers. Their wives report the highest level of happiness with their husbands' expressions of love and affection. Evangelical fathers spend the most time with their children, 3.5 hours more than secular men per week, both in shared activities like sports or church youth group, and in terms of discipline, like setting limits on screen time or enforcing bedtime. And evangelical couples actually divorce at the lowest rate of any major group in America, 35% lower than secular men. And then the real surprise, they have the lowest rates of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. And when I read that, I thought, how come nobody knows this? I had to go digging for it in the academic literature. If you read my footnotes, you see lots of journal articles.
Yeah.
So I thought we need to get this out for two reasons. One is to encourage Christian men.
Yeah.
Right? Because Christian men share in the feeling of demoralization. When I told my class at Houston Christian University that I was writing a book on masculinity, one of my male students shot back, "What masculinity? Yeah. It's been beaten out of us." Okay, so Christian men are feeling this too.
Yeah.
But secondly, obviously for apologetics purposes, we need to be able to get this out into the public and say, the media narrative has it wrong. Yeah. And this is not a pep talk from some religious leader. This is solid empirical research from the social sciences. This is evidence-based findings showing that Christianity does have the power to reconcile the sexes, as I put it in my subtitle.
Yeah, so that's really that was really interesting. It's one of the big kind of what you call it, the shoe drops or mic of it is the first bombs that is thrown into the mix when you first open the book, because like you said, it is exhibit A, and it is that Christian men, evangelical men, but white evangelical men are the problem. And the further we can get away from that, either into some kind of new vision of Christianity that's rewritten or secularizing, the better off we are. And you say, well, that's not what the data shows. Now we'll get back to that. We'll go.
Can I interrupt you for just a minute, though? You used the word white, so I want to say the studies were also done on minorities.
Yeah, and
they also found that evangelical men who attend church regularly do better in their relationships. By the way, married or cohabiting, they studied both. And there's a whole book on it by Brad Wilcox, and I forget who his co-authors are, but Brad Wilcox is a sociologist at the University of Virginia. He was one of my main sources. And he has a book on minorities and not just evangelical Protestants. Because we're in America, most of the research is on Protestants, but sure. I include some research on evangelical Catholics too. So just to show it's a little bit broader than just sort of white Protestant.
Right. So that's excellent point, excellent clarification for our listeners. I mentioned that because typically the accusation is against white evangelical men, but you're right. Just for clarification, your research, no, it doesn't matter. If they're evangelical men, specifically those who attend church more than 3 times a month, is how you put it. But we'll get to that a little bit later. I want to, one of the big aspects of your book for people who haven't read your book is, tracing the history of like how we got here. It's like, okay, if men have a reputation for being toxic, and then how did that happen? Why did we get there? Particularly because you point out, for most of Western kind of history, the reputation was, unfairly, but still it was flipped. Whereas like, men have the reputation for being the more moral sex. Now, again, we would say that's a problem also, is that, men are intrinsically less sinful somehow. But it is an interesting historical question. Wait, how did this flip so much that in, in the society that was even more patriarchal than it is now, men were considered, the morally superior. And now both men and women see women as the more morally superior sex. And so, you trace this to the Industrial Revolution. And so I was wondering if you could give a brief kind of pitch of what you found was the reason for that shift happening, or the inflection point of that.
Yeah, because a lot of people do think, maybe the very concept of toxic masculinity came out of the 1960s, second wave feminism. No, it's much further back. You have to go back to the Industrial Revolution, because prior to that, men worked all day with their wives and children on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so the cultural expectation on men focused much more on their caretaking role, on the responsibility for the common good of the family. Authority itself was defined as who has responsibility for the common good, right? I look out for what's good for me, you look out for what's good for you. But what about the common good of the marriage, the family, the church, civil society? That's what authority was for. In fact, the favorite word of that day was disinterested. The person in authority was not supposed to be looking out for his own interest. He was supposed to be looking out for the good of the whole.
Right.
In fact, it's funny and interesting historical facts. This is one of my favorite. Most of the literature on childbearing back then, which would be sermons, advice manuals, and so on, was addressed to fathers. If you go to a typical bookstore today, they're all written to mothers. Yeah. Most of them. But virtually all the literature was addressed to fathers, because first of all, they did spend just as much time with their children as mothers did. And then they were considered, the primary responsibility, especially for the intellectual and spiritual development of their children. So the question is, how did we lose all this? Well, the Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. That's the main thing it did. But what that meant was men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time, men were not working with their family members, people they loved and had a moral bond with. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And that's when you start to see the language change. You start to see people complain, protest. They didn't like it. They were protesting that men were losing the caretaking ethos of the colonial era, that they were becoming individualistic, self-centered, egocentric, self-interested, look out for number one, greedy and acquisitive, using the language of the day.
Sure.
And even making their career an idol. You saw that quite a bit. As men began to be less, as they began to lose their commitment to Christian faith, they also began turning their career into an idol. And so that's another angle that was happening. In a sense, the Industrial Revolution provided the material conditions for secularization. So as the Industrial Revolution led to a very large split between private and public, right? There's a large public sphere developed of factories, industries, financial institutions, and universities, the state, and so on. People began to argue that these large public institutions should operate by scientific principles, by which they meant value-free. In other words, don't bring your private values into the public realm, which is what we still hear today. So what happened is men were the ones who were getting that secular education, working in that secular environment. And so they also began to secularize in their thinking earlier than women did. And you see that too in the language of the day, complaining that men were not attending church as often. They were not governing their behavior by biblical ethic. In fact, the 19th century is often known as a century when there was a huge increase in crime, gambling, drinking, prostitution, sort of the traditionally male vices all arose in the 19th century. And that was largely the result of secularization. So all that to say, the language of the day was almost as harsh in its criticisms of men as today. Let me give you just one quote. So because of the increase in crime and prostitution and so on, the 19th century also became the century of reform movements. Right? And they were largely driven by women. And so, as one historian puts it this way, these reform movements were implicit condemnations of males. There was little doubt as to the sex of the tavern keeper, the slave master, the drunkard, and the seducer.
Yeah.
So the language of the day became very hostile, very negative, and almost everything that you see today.
Right.
They didn't use the word toxic. That was the only difference. But it was a lot of the language, the rhetoric was extremely negative. And so if you want to find out where it started, if you want to stand against a social trend, you have to ask, where did it start?
Right.
How did it develop? So it started back in the 19th century. And so that's where we have to go back if we want to try to have concrete solutions today.
Sure. No, so I think it's really interesting. I mean, again, one of the things there's a lot of things that are in the book. People should really read the book. There's a lot in there that's really interesting. One of the things I found really interesting as somebody who watches a lot of movies is that a huge number, as more women are getting to direct and write movies, a lot of them are becoming, again, the portrayals of men versus women in those movies are really fascinating, because in movies about men written by men, typically the way they portray women is that women get the smaller roles. They aren't to have as many roles, but within that, women tend to be portrayed generally positively. They're the love interest, they're the wise mother, they're the woman who kind of she doesn't get a lot of lines, but she's gives the words of wisdom to get the guy on the right track, so to speak. Think like Pepper Potts and Iron Man or whatever. There's that's sort of the classic. But in movies that are directed and written by women, I mean, you just think like the new Barbie film, or things done by Greta Gerwig. It's still, men still have the most lines, really, like there's so many men in those movies, but it tends to be about how most of women's problems are caused by men, and men need to reform and change. And what's fascinating as I was reading your book is the explosion of novels in the 19th century, which were predominantly written by women, it was the exact same thing. And so the only difference seems to be that now back then, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, about this analysis, and you can add your own to this. This is just something that was really fascinating to me. The main difference seems to be that in those novels back then, the happy ending, if there was one, is that the man comes back to the home essentially and prioritizes the home. Whereas the happy ending is, Barbie goes off on her own to do her own thing, and the guy just kind of goes away to not be involved. Does my analysis seem to be correct? And sort of how I'm interpreting this, what would you add to it?
Yes, well, most people don't realize that there was a huge explosion of novel writing in the 19th century. In fact, a third of all novels written were by women. Yeah. And the reason we don't know that is because they were eventually suppressed. And the people we know, like James Fenimore Cooper or Melville or even Ernest Hemingway, the ones who got put on the list of classics were all men. But in fact, in terms of sheer numbers, there's a whole book on this. This is fascinating. It's a woman at Duke University who's trying to kind of remind us or teach us again that actually most of the novels written, numerically speaking, the number of novels by women outnumbered the novels by men. And many of them were exactly what you said. Many of them were expressions of the reform movement. So in other words, many of them were expressions in fiction of the fact that many of the social problems of the day were driven by male vices, the traditional male vices, and that women were the ones who were trying to solve it, who were trying to reform these men. And the temperance movement, for example, gave rise to a whole host of novels of men who were alcoholics, destroying their families, beating their wives, driving them to destitution with drink. And then finally some crisis happens and they join the temperance movement. And this is evangelicals joined the novel craze at the time. And they wrote novels. There's a whole book on this too by a British historian, just on evangelical novels.
Wow.
And it's fascinating. And he says, of course, the evangelicals were kind of like the temperance ones. The men were the social problem. They were drinking. They were gambling. There's even one. Two I can think of offhand where where children were killed because of their father's alcoholism. In one case, the father's at the bar, and the mother sends the young daughter to bring him home, and she's hit by a bottle thrown across the room, and she's killed. So there's always some tragic crisis.
Yep.
And then the man gets converted and becomes a Christian. And actually, this historian, it's an Irish historian. He's not very sympathetic, and he concludes the main impact of these evangelical novels was the demonization of men.
Sure.
This is an exact quote. So all that to say that I love the way you're bringing in novels and movies and so on, because that's where a lot of this gets played out. But then there's a reaction against that. Okay, yeah. So the reaction against that is like the late 19th, early 20th century. You get male fiction writers who celebrated the opposite,
yeah.
Right? Who all said, to understand why, they began to feel as though since the Industrial Revolution, they were not growing up on the farm. They were not growing up out in nature. They were not these strong, hardy farm boys anymore. Yeah. They were sitting behind a desk and growing pale and thin and weak. And a new word entered the English vocabulary: over-civilized. Over-civilized. Men began to fear that men were becoming over-civilized. And part of that was because of these reform movements being driven by women that was holding them down. And so a whole genre, maybe not a genre, Westerns were a genre, but there were a whole movement of male authors who celebrated men who got away from civilization, out into the wild. There were frontiersmen, there were cowboys, there were scouts, there were Indian scouts. James Fenimore Cooper was probably the best known, the last of the Mohicans. But Herman Melville says he set his stories at sea because he thought that was, in his words, the place of the utmost male license. Where men could be totally free from any sort of moral or civilizational rules. He told women not to read his books, by the way. He said, don't read them. They're not for you. So there was a whole movement of male authors, too, who said, hey, to recover our true authentic manhood, we need to escape from civilization, escape from women and family, get out there and recover our innate toughness. It's kind of the precursors to Robert Bly in our own day, right? The 1990s. Taking men out to the wilderness. Go ahead.
No, so this is really fascinating to me again, because this is one of those things that I see in our own day as well. With again, things like Greta Gerwig's movies and a lot of these sort of is that what I found fascinating again, not to be picking on Barbie, but it's the most famous. It's one everybody knows, and so I've watched a lot of nerdy female-centric feminist movies that other people haven't seen and won't get if I make a reference to it. But they do a really interesting thing, which is that they say, basically, you have two choices as a man: to be either, as a way of putting it, is douche Ken or doormat Ken, basically. And, is that you have to be, submissive to whatever Barbie tells you, or you are a bad guy. And that's sort of the option that they give. And the thing is, just like the novels of the 19th century, the women saying this think men will watch this and decide, okay, I need to be the good Ken. That's what I'm going to be. But, historically, what was done is that actually it said, no, if I have a choice between being, douche Ken or doormat Ken, I'm going to be douche Ken. And I'm going to take on your fact that true masculinity means being a bad person. And I'm going to embrace being a bad person. And so it's okay, what they're going to do is, again, they're going to say, okay, I'm going to go, embrace Andrew Tate. I'm going to embrace that kind of thing. If that's what you're saying true masculinity is, that's where I'm going to go. And that's what I think is fascinating, is I see that happening today. And of course, that's a historical precedent, is that whole thing of demonizing men in that way led to men embracing that label, but just saying, I'm going to consider all these vices to be good things. Now, I do have a question for you related to that, which is, you make a remark in there which is that, even starting in the Civil War and things like that. And, most of the time when people have power, they don't want to give it up. When it is, most of the time, that tends to be a general rule. And yet it seems like you note this, that men gave up their status as the moral arbiters surprisingly easily. as I'm wondering if you have any theories as to why that is. There's different authors that talk about this, the alienation from Christianity and Christian virtues that happened, like David Murrow, who's talked about that started kind of in the 14th century. So the groundwork was already sort of being laid for it. But I don't know, like, what is your theory as to why men sort of gave that up so easily in sort of America?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it takes us back to what you said earlier. So earlier you said, how did it happen that men used to be considered morally stronger? Yeah. And then in the 19th century, suddenly women were considered morally superior. So let me just comment briefly on that, because yes, all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, it had been thought that men were morally stronger. The reasoning was this. They thought the insight into right and wrong was a rational insight, and they thought that men were more rational, and therefore men were more virtuous. Right. In fact, the root of the word virtue, vir, is Latin for man, as in the word virile, right? Manly. Okay, yeah. So virtue had overtones of manly strength and honor. So that was a huge shift. Most people think it's forever women were considered superior. No, this was a huge shift just in the 19th century. And why did men go along with it? It's so interesting. One thing I wanted to, just as a background comment, several people have wondered where I got my history, because it's not what they've normally heard. There were whole libraries of histories written by women because of the feminist movement. There are very few in the history of men written by men. Two major ones, and then some minor ones like History of Fatherhood and so on. And so I'm giving you the history of men from men's perspective. Those are the books I read. And here's how one male author, one historian puts it when answering just that very question that you raised. He said, why would men go along with the idea that women were superior? That when women were set up as the moral guardians of society, it became accepted that women would spearhead these reform movements that, challenge male irresponsibility. Why'd they go along with it? Here's how he puts it. It let men off the hook. If it's up to women to tame men, to civilize men, then men can be as greedy and irresponsible and lustful as they want to be, and then leave it up to women to tame them. And that's almost his exact words. I don't have it memorized. Sure. He uses the phrase several times. It let men off the hook. It gave men a pass on moral responsibility. It reduced the moral expectations of men. Hey, they like that. So I thought that was fascinating that male authors pick up on that men went along with it because what it did is it let them off the hook. And the language of the day was that it's up to women to tame men. It's up to women to civilize men. And by the way, it's still out there. Sure. The most recent is George Gilder. George Gilder, yes. Yeah, you can say, yeah. You take him to task very welcomely from my point of view. Yeah, because he uses extreme language about, the man's natural impulse is to be violent, sexually predatory, irresponsible, alcoholic, et cetera, et cetera. And then he says it's up to women to tame men. And he goes so far as to say men need to adopt the woman's morality. Civilization depends on men taking the woman's morality, to which I say, no, it's not. Men have to follow God's morality, not women's morality. What man is going to be moral if you tell him it's a woman's standard that he has to submit to? I can't believe George Gilder thinks that this is going to fly.
Yeah, happily it's been getting a lot of pushback from good places. But now, so this is okay. So again, I want to make there's so much fascinating stuff here I'm really interested in. Now, so again, one of your main kind of theses in your book, obviously, is that like you said, it's not innately more. Men are not innately more toxic kind of than women, or more naturally evil than women. This is a cultural script that's gotten adopted. On the flip side, you do have a lot of references in there to the fact that historically, outside of Christianity, men have been extremely toxic, and it's been up to Christianity to sort of civilize them. Perhaps not, women to civilize them, but it's up to Christianity to civilize them. Certainly, you talk about, the ancient Romans and Greeks and how warlike and, oppressive and abusive they were. You talk about, different countries, even sort of more recently, who, are, just the same real man, toxic masculinity script that we hear about today. And when Christianity comes into those places, they become more civilized. And you've pointed out, I know you've pointed this out on Twitter, but like when you have more men than women in a population, the population gets more violent. And so there is a sense in which a lot of the stuff you bring in does, and on the flip side, though, women aren't more violent until Christianity comes in. They aren't, less nurturing until Christianity comes in. Christianity does seem to have a civilizing effect on men that makes them more like the way women seem to be naturally. And so isn't there a sense in which there is evidence to show to some degree that, it is true that men are more intrinsically toxic, at least in these ways, than women are, and Christianity's influence sort of is a way of, bringing men to virtues that women seem to have more naturally? Or how would you push back on that?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I stick mostly with America, but I have a short section on international where it's really exciting. And it's very encouraging to see that when Christianity goes into, say, a machismo culture, for example. Yeah. And, I'm quoting sociologists, anthropologists, who say, well, I'll give you just the first one, because she was a Marxist, an anthropologist who was a Marxist, and who expected to find that where evangelicalism goes, it creates this, top-down patriarchy. That was her word. And she found the opposite. She found that where evangelical Christianity goes, it counters machismo culture, which allowed men to be, sleeping around, gambling, and spending their money on male pleasures and so on. And they bring their money home, devote it to their family, and the whole family experiences an increase in their standard of living. So I quote a couple different authors on that. So I think that is fun. It's great to see that Christianity has that effect. And by the way, one of my readers was a man who runs a development organization, international development. And he thought I was far too kind on men, because he's out there seeing how non-Christian cultures are very, very oppressive to women. But here's how I won him over. I'll give you two sets of studies. I'll try to make this short. One of them is by an anthropologist. It was the first ever cross-cultural study of concepts of masculinity. And he found that they had differences in their definitions of masculinity. Some cultures are more warlike, some are more peaceful. But he found that all cultures share the conviction that a good man will perform what he calls the 3 Ps: provide, protect, and procreate. Meaning, become a father, build into the next generation. In other words, he found that there was an intrinsic sense, inherent, universal, like I said, cross-cultural. This was a global study. That men seem to innately know that their unique masculine strengths are not given them just to get what they want and domineer over other people, but provide and protect those that they love. So I thought this was fascinating, because I would say men are made in God's image. They do have a part of them, at least, that inherently recognizes this. Or you could maybe call it general revelation.
Sure. Yeah.
What we know from revelation, as opposed to special revelation, which is the Bible. What we can just know from nature. The second one, which is one I put right at the beginning of the book, was done by a sociologist, and it's global because he speaks all around the world. And neither of these guys are Christian, by the way. And he came up with a clever experiment where he asked young men 2 questions. The first question is, what does it mean to be a good man? Yeah. If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man, what does that mean? And the sociologist said, all around the world, young men had no trouble answering that. They would immediately say things like honor, duty, sacrifice, integrity, do the right thing, look out for the little guy, provide, protect, be responsible. And he would ask them, where'd you learn that? And they'd say, I don't know, it's just in the air we breathe.
Yeah.
Or if they were in a Western country, they would say it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage.
Right.
And then he would ask a follow-up question. What does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man?
Yeah.
And the young men would say, oh, no, that's completely different. That means be tough, be strong, never show weakness, suck it up, win at all costs. What else? Be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language. And so sociology concludes, men seem to, again, inherently, innately know what it means to be the good man. They do aspire to be good, but they're also feeling social pressure from their culture to be the quote unquote real man, which are traits that we mostly would consider more toxic, especially if they get decoupled from a moral ideal. It can slip into, entitlement, dominance, control, and so on. And so I thought this was really insightful and gives us maybe a better way to approach these issues. Instead of accusing men of being toxic, which most men don't respond very well to, a better approach is to, can we tap into their innate sense of what it means to be a good man? And make an allyship with what their internal knowledge, aspiration of being good. And that gives us just a much more positive way to approach these issues.
Okay. So now one of the biggest criticisms that I've seen of your book, and I'd be really interested in getting your pushback on this, is on, because you basically make the case, again, as Christian apologists and and going against the grain of the culture, you make the case that the culture gets it exactly wrong when it says that Christianity is a problem, secularization essentially is a solution. Then particularly feminist secularization, but and then what you're saying is actually the problem is secularization. There was a secular script that replaced the Christian script, and going back to Christianity, the Christian script of manhood is the solution. And you can see this because men who are more likely to adopt the Christian script are the least likely to be toxic. You gave all the stats earlier. The common criticism of that I've seen is, how do we know these people are telling the truth? Because as you lay out, in your book, there is a lot of gaslighting that goes on toward abused women in evangelical cultures and church cultures about like, hey, I'm being abused, but I tell people that I'm being abused, and they say, oh, you're not being abused, or it's partly your fault, and whatever. And a lot of, sort of ex-evangelicals, particularly women, talk about their experiences of, I was in this culture and I was told that I was happy, and I was sort of convinced I was. And finally, I got out. Again, I don't mean to be picking on Barbie, but again, in that movie, you have, the Barbies who then go and see the brainwashed Barbies in Kingdom. And it's like, oh, they think they're happy, but they're actually not. And if we just feed them enough, kind of this sort of feminist lines, they'll realize that they're unhappy and they'll get out of that. And so this is always the question, kind of when it comes to self-reporting, is how do we know that when these people say that, these women say they're the most happy, and when they say that they're least likely to say that their husband's abusing them and stuff like that, how do we know that that's actually true? Is there indications within the data of why we should trust that interpretation of it?
Well, let me say, first of all, it's not just evangelicals. All women, all abused women have a problem with this. My own sister worked for many years in a shelter for abused women. And she said, it's a common problem. It's everywhere. She said, one of the hardest things I face is trying to persuade women that what they experience qualifies as abuse. So it's not an evangelical issue. It's universal. But secondly, this might be the place to say that there is abuse in Christian homes.
Yes.
But here's the deal. So, it started with people pushing back and saying, well, wait a minute, don't Christian couples divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture? In my research, I found this one of the most widely quoted statistics by Christian leaders. And so the researchers went back to the data, and they made that crucial distinction between men who do attend church regularly and very authentic in their commitment versus nominal Christians And so my students don't know what nominal means, so I have to explain. NOM is Latin for name, so it means in name only. So what this means in a survey like this, they might check, say, the Baptist box, for example, but they rarely go to church if at all. It's a cultural Christianity, it's family background. And these men test out shockingly different. They fit all the toxic stereotypes. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness. And by the way, they have no problem admitting that they're not happy. They lowest level of happiness. These men spend the least amount of time with their children. These couples have the highest rate of divorce, higher than secular men, 20% higher than secular men. And the real shocker is that they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence, higher than secular men.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about evangelicals, if you just do an overarching study, you're going to get misleading statistics, right? You're going to get men who are better than secular men and men who are worse than secular men. And so this dividing out these two groups proved to be extremely important for understanding what's really going on. And maybe, it's good for the church too. On the one hand, I think they need to be more supportive of the men who are doing a good job, right? One of my graduate students is the head of a women's ministry in a large Baptist church here in Houston. And she said, on Mother's Day, we hand out roses and tell mothers they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better. And so I think, I tried very hard to avoid a scolding tone.
Yeah, you did. I think you were excellent about that. I was very appreciative about that.
And I think churches need to do that. They need to start supporting the men because men are demoralized and defeated and, feel beaten down as well, Christian men.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it does suggest maybe we need to really start thinking how to have a ministry to these men who are sort of at the fringes, who are claiming an evangelical identity, but who are taking words like headship and submission and importing meanings from the secular script, like dominance and control. And I stumbled just today. I stumbled on some Twitter accounts called Biblical Manhood, saying things like women are not made in the image of God.
Oh dear gosh!
Yes, literally. My husband decided it was a fake account. He couldn't believe anyone would really say this. So we'll say, women are not made in the image of God. Women are property. Women are just for sex and kids. I mean, it's very extreme.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I would say
I'm familiar with the Theo Bros. Yes. So
this was even worse, I think.
Okay.
At any rate, they're out there is my point.
Yes.
And so I think the church and claiming this is biblical manhood. So I think the church needs to really think through how do we reach out to these men and disciple them better.
Yeah. I think one thing that was really eye-opening reading your book was that I think, again, this is just my reading and what I got out of it was the fact that, there's two types of marital problems. There's, healthy marital problems and, abusive marital problems. And oftentimes, the advice that pastors are giving is about healthy marital problems in abusive situations. Because you said, look, being more loving, being more understanding is actually good advice in a healthy relationship, because it's like, if you're having conflicts, learning to be more, more Christ-like, as people talk about, being to be, empathetic and loving, so is good advice if you're in a basically healthy relationship. And it would make sense if, again, the people who attend church more are the more healthy kind of men, that pastors are, basing their experience about what is the best way to go about things on the men they know best. Well, I know what would work with the men I know best, in a situation. But you're right. It's two types of men you're talking about. You're talking about, generally speaking, obviously there's exceptions to every rule, but generally speaking, the men most likely to be abusive are the ones that the pastors know the least well. And so that causes a special challenge of, okay, how do we disciple the people who are more likely to be toxic when they don't have as close relationships with the church and the pastor? I have this is kind of a question, sort of, again, let me know, don't feel you have to be okay for the camera. Let me know if you have to go. But I'm really excited by this topic, and I'm really excited to talk to you about it. But it's there's a lot of literature right now on the, generally speaking, again, if Christianity is the antidote to toxic masculinity, then one of the biggest problems is the fact that men don't go to church. And when they do go to church, they're not enthusiastic about it. I go to church and I look at the men versus women in the pews. And typically, again, it's like 70-30 women to men. And even places where it's more even, you can see the level of enthusiasm from the women versus the level of enthusiasm from the men. It's like satirical almost, the gender gap of that. And you talk about that very honestly in the book. And there's been a lot of people, like David Murrow and Leon Podol's and such, who've been trying to unpack why this is, and even more importantly than why it is, like, what do we do about it? And I'm wondering, like, what do you see as ways forward for people who want to speak to bringing men into church and generating the level of enthusiasm that they can be discipled? What do you think that looks like?
Yeah, that you went through several points. I do want to respond to what you said at the beginning, because nominal men are actually more abusive even than secular men. I did have to have 2 chapters on abuse in the book. And you're absolutely right. That was a good insight on your part, I think, by the way. The fact that the reason that so many pastors are ineffective in counseling truly abusive couples is that they don't know that many. And so the good news is, if anyone is in an abusive environment, there are more and more books coming out by Christians. I wrote this book at the right time because everything I've read before was tended to make the wife responsible, right? Oh, well, if you would just love more, forgive more, make his favorite meals, have more sex, lose weight and look better, if you would just, and of course, if you would only submit more, I should have said that first, then you can change your husband and he will stop being abusive. And fortunately, there are more and more therapists and theologians out there saying, actually, that doesn't work.
Right. Yeah.
And we should have known that, because that doesn't work in any situation with a bully. Right?
Yeah.
Well, the playground bully or international affairs, the belligerent nation. If you acquiesce and placate, they get worse.
Yes. Yeah.
It's the same with marriage. So fortunately, there are much better resources out there on that subject. And what to do about men? That's a really good question, because, by the way, the average congregation is 60-40.
Okay.
It's 60% female, 40% male. And you mentioned David Murrow, who wrote the book, Why Men Hate Going to Church. And he has a website called Church for Men. And he does have suggestions. They tend to be fairly simple things, things that you can do that don't require a lot of work, like don't have pastel decor, have rocks and exposed wood kind of things, and don't have a Kleenex box at the end of each pew, and don't have those horrible flannel banners. Men don't like those. I don't either, but anyway, and even the music. Can we think of music that's a little more rousing and has more of an objective tone? I grew up Lutheran, so our hymns were always very objective. They were, praising God for his attributes, whereas modern praise choruses is my feelings. I feel this way, I feel that way, I love you, God. So I really am very aware of that distinction. And men tend to be more drawn to those more objective hymns. And of course, even the making them low enough so that men can sing them more easily.
Yeah.
So David Murrow, Church for Men, has a lot of that, and he has some stories of people who've tried them, and it's worked. He has one story. My favorite one was it was a female pastor.
Yeah.
Because he was speaking one time, and he said, "How many of you have tried these and tried some of these strategies and see them work?" And he said, a hand went up, and it had red nail polish on it. I thought, what? Did you understand the question? And it was a female pastor who was using his strategies. So I think that's encouraging, that sometimes it doesn't take super difficult, throwing your whole church upside down. It can be fairly simple external things that can work. And frankly, I've talked to a lot of women who agree they would like it better too. I told the story of my book, Total Truth, which...
Oh, yes.
Did you remember? Where is it? It's a Total Truth. when that was first public, they sent it out to the design company. And of course, the design company doesn't read the book. They just get a short description. They see, women's book. And so they designed a cover with a teacup on a doily. and the words, the title was in baby blue with sort of curly cues on the font. I had to send it back and say, this is not a woman's book. but of course, when I tell that story, women say, well, I wouldn't buy that book either. Yeah. So even women, the assumption is that because the congregation is more women, because more women than men go to Christian bookstores, more women than men are in Sunday school and small groups, more women than men listen to Christian music, it is kind of understandable that marketers and preachers and book producers all kind of start to gear towards what they think are women's tastes. So it is natural, but I do think it's something we need to stand against and start respecting men enough to say, let's see what will attract them.
Yeah, I think you make an excellent point. Again, there's the, people, it often gets, again, turned into a sort of a right-left thing because what a lot of egalitarians, their concern is how do we get more women in the pulpits, and the concern of a lot of the, Christian manosphere, let's say, is how do we get more men in the pews? And of course, again, regardless of what you think about the theology of it, those shouldn't be contradictory. It's like, even egalitarians should be concerned of, we should probably have more men in the pews, even if we want to have more women in the pulpits. And so seeing men as a group that's, unchurched or that should be, even if for no other reason, that every single Christian girl I know is like, where are the Christian men in the other pews that I can possibly date? So I think that's good. Yeah, no. So David Murrow and Leon Podles, they've done some interesting work on that. So people check that out and using Church for Men, that website, checking out. So again, a couple more questions. One is, and this is kind of interesting. One of the things you say, which is really interesting, you make an argument that even in relationships, perhaps that they're not abusive, but where the relationship breaks down. One of the things that sort of the manosphere and the Christian manosphere, the Christian right, kind of is there's always this fight basically in our culture, who's to blame for the high divorce rates and for marriages that are falling apart, and often the sort of women and women will tend to blame men and men will tend to blame women on this. And of course, the men will point to the, divorce rates primarily being, driven by women, something like 70, 80%. And of course, women will, put back and say, yes, but it's because you're making us miserable. And of course, your book, you lay out, study from Gottman Institute and some other things. They're saying like, basically, yes, the women are right. The problem is that, what it takes to make a relationship work is that you need to love and respect your partner and invest in making sure that, your partner feels loved and respected. And predominantly women and wives are putting that work in and men are not, because women are sort of socialized to both believe that's a responsibility that they have and to have the social skills to be able to do that, whereas men are not. And that's sort of an argument we make sort of at the latter end of the book. And so men need to step up and, take on that responsibility of actually, being better about that. Now, one of the things, would that be a correct kind of summation of sort of what you're saying?
Yes. And what I find interesting, though, is I'm quoting secular people on this.
Yeah.
I want to make sure people realize one of them, it's just in the end notes, so you may not remember this one, but there's a book called it's called something like How to Improve Your Marriage Without Talking. In other words, it's about understanding the differences between men and women so that they can accommodate each other without having to discuss every little thing. Right. But anyway, one of the quotes they have there is, yes, women are more likely to leave the marriage. 80%, it is 80% now. Okay. And among college-educated women, it's 90% who file for divorce. But if you talk to the women, this is a quote from their book, women will say, the man left the relationship emotionally long before she left physically.
Yeah.
So that's how women see it. Yeah. And then the others that I quote, like Gottman's not a Christian. He has a Jewish background. He's not a Christian. And he's the one who says 86% of American men do not respect their wives, or in his word, accept influence from their wives. In other words, 86% of men do not listen to their wives, take their wives' concerns into account when they're making decisions, do not respect their opinion, do not seek out, their thoughts. This is 86, and this is, again, a non-Christian guy. 86% of men do not. And then he says, this is not to blame or shame men. It's like you said, it's that they have not been socialized to value their relationship in the way that women are socialized to. The other one, my other favorite psychotherapist is Terry Real. Again, not a Christian. And he specializes in marriages that are just on the verge of divorce.
Sure.
And he's done so well that he's been on 2020 and Oprah and all kinds of programs because, like, how do you do this? But he won't even take you unless you've already been through 3 or 4 therapists, sure, right? So these are very, very troubled marriages. And you know what he says? It's usually the man who has to change. It's usually the man. Not always, but sure, the majority of the time, it's the man who's not investing in the relationship. It's the man who's not respecting his wife. It's the man who's not listening. And he says, I almost always take the woman's side. He said, it's a cardinal law in psychotherapy that you do not take sides. He says, I break that rule. I take sides. He says, I take the side of the underdog, the one who's being overpowered in the marriage, which is usually the wife. Not always, but usually. And so he says, I take the side of the underdog. I get the underdog to stand up. I encourage them. I strengthen them to stand up and speak for themselves. And I encourage the overbearing partner to calm down, step down a bit and learn a little humility by listening to the other side. And he's been enormously successful with men. People say, how do you do that? Because in therapy, if there's somebody who walks out, it's usually the man, right? The man says, hey, I'm not doing this work, bye. And they work with him. And he says, it's because I'm honest with them. I tell them, let me give you the bad news. You're wrong. He literally says that. What you're doing is wrong. Would you like me to tell you what's wrong? You want to fix your marriage or not? If you do, I'll tell you what's wrong. And they usually say, well, yeah, okay. Stick it to me straight. They respect that. They respect that. But so my main point is I'm quoting secular therapists and psychologists on all of these issues, which I think is interesting. In case somebody thinks this is a Christian perspective, no, it's
sure. Yeah, no. So, I think it's, again, this may be outside again, this is interesting because I hear these conversations back and forth. Again, I'm part of this whole conversation about, male, female stuff online and in the Christian space, but also in the secular space. And this may be, this is not if you don't have an off the top answer to this question, that's fine. But that's no problem at all. But one of the things that is pointed out oftentimes when the question thing is brought up, well, it's usually the guy's fault, essentially, in these things is when a marriage falls apart. One of the things that's often brought up is, the statistics for lesbian divorce. If it was the reason that these marriages are mostly breaking down is because women are socialized better to invest in and care about and to fix problems in a relationship, and men are not, you would think that lesbians would have the lowest divorce rate. And in fact, the exact opposite is true. They have the highest divorce rate. And so for many people the sort of men on the right, okay, well, it seems then maybe that there's the problem in the heterosexual relationships is not mostly exclusively the male province. I don't know. Again, would you have an off the cuff kind of response to that?
Yeah, sure. Sure.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you have a same-sex couple, it tends to exaggerate whatever their characteristics are of that sex. So two men together tend to exaggerate the male characteristics because there's nothing to counterbalance it. Sure. And so that's why the majority of male homosexual relationships are not monogamous. Right. They're open. Yeah. They just agree that it's okay to have relationships on the side.
When the husband in that relationship says it didn't mean anything, the other person says, "Okay, I'll accept that. It didn't mean anything for me either." Yeah.
Yeah, wasn't a journalist named Michael Savage who said, "Well, we're monogamish." He became famous for saying that. In other words, we'll have a main guy, but it's okay to have several on the side. Two women will exaggerate that intense emotional attachment, that intense, wanting everything out of the relationship, almost like, the expectations are so intense. And you have to remember this too. The mating and dating pool is smaller. Heterosexuals have a much wider pool. If I lose this woman, I don't have that many other options. Yeah. And so I become intensely jealous, intensely possessive. I know that if I lose this one, there's not many other options. So ironically, it's one of those cases where over expectation can then lead to disillusionment. If you expect too much, you get hurt more and you say, okay, I'm out. It's actually, I think, one of the reasons that women file for divorce more, even in heterosexual relationships. The woman wants more. And so she's more easily disappointed. She's more easily hurt and says, well, this isn't what I signed up for. Whereas the man's like, I didn't really want that much anyway. I don't care about intimacy. Men. There's lots of ways to go with this.
Of course, yeah.
There's the Myers-Briggs personality types. Where men are more likely to be T in the Myers-Briggs, which means more objective, less emotional. Like, okay, if less geared towards sort of personal intimacy, whereas women, it's 65% roughly, according to. So it's a majority. It's a majority. It's not all men by any means, but it's a majority. And
it's like height. It's like height. It's mostly, but also mostly overlapped.
Exactly. So, but it is where the stereotypes come from. Whereas women are 65% roughly of women are F, and the F is the more emotional, more relational, more sensitive. And again, that's a majority, but not all. And so that's where these stereotypes come from. It is true that it's more likely, by the way, I thought it was interesting that 65% of men are T in the Myers-Briggs. And John Gottman found that 65% of men don't pay attention to their wives. Well, maybe there's a connection there. They're T's. They're not geared toward the emotional state of their wives or children. So maybe there's a connection. And then women are more F, which means they are more geared towards wanting intimacy, connection, emotional sensitivity, and they are more easily hurt.
So if I can, let me know if this sounds, reasonable to say from like an evangelical sort of imagination. Let's say the way that we describe it is that, there are two separate problems going on, in a heterosexual relationship versus a lesbian relationship, to use this example, is that in a heterosexual relationship, the most common problem is that men are not fulfilling their responsibility as men to be, to be good husbands, in the relationship. But for lesbians, there is no husband to be a good husband in the relationship. That's also necessary. That is part of God's design. That would sort of be in the evangelical imagination, how they would kind of accommodate both of those data points.
It is true. One of the researchers I read said, men have been sort of socialized that they're going to get their main sense of masculinity, manly fulfillment from their career. And so men literally don't realize how much they actually just derive their sense of fulfillment from their family. I quoted this particular researcher in the chapter on fatherhood because I quoted men who found out becoming a father was so fulfilling, and they felt like, how come nobody told me? Nobody told me how much joy I would get out of having children. And I'm not averse to appealing to men's self-interest. So I have studies showing how much men benefit from becoming fathers. Some psychologists call it the dad brain. There's a nest of neurons that don't get activated unless a man becomes a father. So he literally grows his brain when he becomes a father. He also, people didn't used to know this. They knew that mothers have an increase in oxytocin when they become mothers, which is the bonding hormone, which gives her a little biochemical boost in attaching to her baby, and babies need that. They're so helpless. We didn't realize that fathers also experience an increase in oxytocin, especially when it's stimulated by touch. So they have to be actually holding and playing with and cuddling their child. And this was the most recent one. So this was the most surprising. An anthropologist, it's in a book called The Life of Dad. An anthropologist discovered that the man's oxytocin is actually increasing all 9 months of his wife's pregnancy. Apparently, nobody had ever thought to test a man's blood when his wife was pregnant. But when they did, they found out that a man is being biochemically primed to be an involved father all through his wife's pregnancy. And I thought, this is great. God has really designed the man for fatherhood. People who think, well, mothers are just, Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, made this sort of a common understanding that motherhood is natural for women, but fatherhood is a social construction. No, it's just as much built in the man's biochemistry as it is in the mother's biochemistry. And I think that really underscores that God gave both men and women the cultural mandate, right? In Genesis, be fruitful and multiply is given to both men and women. Subdue the earth is given to both men and women. And most of the moral prescriptions in the Bible are given to both men and women as well. The gifts of the Spirit, the fruit of the Spirit. There's not a lot of differentiation in Scripture between men and women, but I like to help people realize that, contrary to the sort of macho script of today, men are actually, all the way down to the biochemistry, are equipped to be good fathers.
That's awesome. So I have just 2 more questions. If you want to do just one more, I can cut out one of them. But
let's see.
Okay,
Go ahead.
Okay, cool. So one of the things, again, I try to like to ask questions that some people are going to ask, but also that other people, I'm not hearing other people ask as much. But one of the things that, again, I find sort of the Christian manosphere is one of their frustrations with evangelical culture, is something you kind of point out as a positive thing in your book, because you talk about like, how is, male headship interpreted by most evangelical, marriages. And what you find is that, for the majority, the idea of male headship, first of all, it connote, is implied more responsibility than authority. Responsibility is emphasized over authority, where it's like, it's my job to take care of my family and provide and be, good, husband and father and responsible for their spiritual well-being and such like that. And authority, even when you say, okay, there's a tiebreaker element, authority is never really exercised. Even there's like, I can't, you're talking about couples and saying, I can't remember the last time that was ever really used, that tiebreaker authority. And one of the frustrations that I see a lot of sort of ex-evangelical men who ex-evangelate to the right, let's say, is that sort of servant headship in evangelical Christianity translates to servantship. That it's all responsibility, no authority. It's extra response, like at least egalitarian marriages, they kind of say, don't give you extra responsibility without giving you extra authority. In evangelical situations, they find you're given extra responsibility, but aren't given extra authority along with it. And yet you talk about, in a sense, one of the positive things is that they are focusing on the responsibility aspect, which means they're less likely to be draconian and abusive with authority. And so I was wondering, how would you give people a vision of, from what you've seen and all just your own observations, your own experiences, whatnot, for how servant headship should be imagined by these men who are kind of like, it seems like it's a trick to give us a raw deal. Alexander Hamilton said, authority and responsibility have to be matched. You can't give. And so how does it look to have whatever higher responsibility I have be matched with greater authority without that becoming abusive?
Well, first of all, I have heard what you're saying. In other words, there are some people who say that servant leadership has gone to the point where it means servanthood. It's just that I don't see it. I just don't see it. If I may, I'll even go back to my secular authorities. You know, when John Gottman said 65% of American men don't respect their wives, I mean, he's giving us sort of a big picture. He's not just and Terry Real, perhaps the most famous psychotherapist of our day right now. By the way, he wrote the first book on male depression. So he's an expert specifically on male psychology, and he too says, unfortunately, too many in my experience, the couples coming into my practice, it's usually the man who has to change. So I'm not seeing this idea of Christian men are being turned into wimps, which is kind of what I hear the accusation. And in the social science, the surveys that were done, by the way, I wanted to clarify what the surveys were and why I included them. The surveys were done by people who are, again, looking at the secular world. What are the accusations coming in from the secular world? They were not looking at egalitarian versus complementarian. And so what they found, well, first of all, I was pretty blown away by how they defined headship and submission in such loving, respectful, mutual ways. I really didn't expect them to express it this way. But it's true that they did not mostly talk about final authority or breadwinner or tiebreaker. The most common phrase was spiritual leader. And then when they were asked, well, what does that mean? They said the normal practical things for starters. They said, get your family to church on Sunday, get your kids to youth group, have family devotions and family prayer. But they also talked about the sort of intangibles, like feeling responsible for your children's spiritual growth, feeling responsible for your wife's spiritual well-being. And so most of them spoke in terms of a kind of authority, but in the old-fashioned way. Remember, I said in the colonial era, authority meant who has responsibility for the common good. And I'm not sure if they're using that kind of language because, we've lost that terminology of common good. But that seems to be what they mean. It's my job to make sure that the family overall is doing well. And even sort of many of them spoke in terms of who takes the initiative. Right? If you see a problem in your family, the house is dirty.
Sure.
You take the initiative, you start cleaning up and then say, follow me, do what I'm doing. If you feel like your family needs a deeper spiritual life, you get a deeper spiritual life. And then, bring your family along. If you feel like your kids are watching too much media, you talk about the importance of having a Christian mind and how can we develop a Christian mind. And maybe you start having, family time where you read good classical books together around the family dinner table. So a lot of them defined it in terms of taking the initiative to fix the problem. So I thought that was a good description, and it fits with what Genesis says when it says, who leaves their family, who leaves their family home, their parents. You realize that in most cultures it's the woman who has to leave. Like India, China, wherever. It's in most traditional cultures the woman leaves and joins the man's family. So I think it's very significant that Genesis says no. The man has to take the initiative to leave his family, what's comfortable, what's natural to him, and go out and start a new family. Initiate a new family structure. So it's not, and contrary to George Gilder, it's not the woman who's supposed to entice him and seduce him into staying faithful. No, he's called before God to be the faithful husband and father.
Very cool. That's a good answer. The final word again, if there's, for people who are listening, you again, I encourage people to read the book, for, the prescriptions for what one does, about what you can do as individuals and what we can do as a society to make these corrections, to the real man script or the toxic masculinity script and such. But what would you, if you could just kind of give an encouragement or thoughts for people who are saying, yeah, this is something I want to get on board with, fixing this problem, and were wondering what are ideas for solutions to that? What would you kind of, where would you point them? How would you encourage them? What advice would you give?
The most important long-term solution to toxic behavior in men is fathers getting closer to their kids, the sons in particular, right? Because if the sons are not growing up with a healthy, positive, biblical view of masculinity, they will become the next generation of toxic men. So there's a psychiatrist who I quote and who says, we're not going to have a better class of men until we have a better class of fathers. And so I think one of the things we should think about as a church is how can we help fathers be more involved with their sons? And I have a whole chapter on ways that we can kind of flex the workplace, because most men say the biggest barrier still is the workplace, right? Ever since the Industrial Revolution, we're out of the home all day. What do we do about that? And the pandemic actually had a small silver lining in that a lot of fathers did discover that they liked being home more. Once in one survey, 65% of fathers said, "Hey, I like this. I want to go. I don't want to go back to the office full time. Maybe a hybrid situation, something that allows me to work more from home." And the New York Times just had you live in New York. I wonder if you saw this. The New York Times, maybe just 2 months ago or so, had an article titled something like, "During the pandemic, fathers got closer to their children, and they don't want to lose that." And I thought, even the New York Times says this. So I do have, I'll just give you an anecdote because sometimes an anecdote crystallizes it. One of my graduate students is married to an IT professional who came home during the pandemic. Because he was home, he was able to be more involved with homeschooling. He decided he would be the one to make lunch every day. He could take his kids to soccer practice or choir practice. He picked up so many of the family responsibilities that his wife started a part-time business. She's an opera singer, by the way. So she started a voice studio. And the whole family benefited from the added income. So I interviewed her husband for the book, and he said, our family is so much more balanced now. I am never going back to 40 hours in a cubicle. And then he said, and the final kicker was, he said, the time that I used to spend commuting every morning, I now spend praying with my wife every morning. I thought, okay, that kind of crystallizes the kind of thing that we might want to try to move toward as we think, how can we raise a better generation of sons? That's the long-term solution.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy. This has been amazing. So I want to tell everyone, go out, agree or disagree with what is in the book, or, agree with some parts of the book and disagree with others. This is a book you should be reading in order. I'm just going to say this, in order to be be versed enough to talk about these issues, in a intelligent way. You should read this book and understand the data that she's putting forth and the arguments that Professor Pearcey is putting forth. So it's available on Amazon, and anywhere you get books that should be gotten. That's the Toxic War on Masculinity, how Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, is you can get that there, and you should. So anything else, if you anywhere else, if people want to get in touch with you or have questions for you or things like that, where and to get your other books and such like that, where can they go?
Yes, well, my publisher generously redesigned my website, so it's nice and colorful. I know, that's nice. So nancypearcey.com, PEARCEY.com, nancypearcey.com. Come on over, browse my other books. You've mentioned Love Thy Body. Come on, check out, see what that's about. And yes, you can leave comments. I read the comments. I don't have time to answer all of them, but I will read them. So nancypearcey.com. Come on by and say hello.
Well, thank you so much. You were so generous with your time. I was looking forward to this, and I'm so excited got to do it. And thank you, all of you. If you've made it to the end, you are better than other people. Thank you so much for listening. God loves you more. That's a joke, by the way, but this has been so much fun. Thank you so much again, Professor Pearcey. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Once again, this is the Religion Unplugged podcast for your regular religious news and culture.